Welcome, everyone, to Easy History Podcast. It's time for another deep dive, and today we're really going deep into a pivotal moment. Britain's involvement in World War I.
A big one.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just another conflict, right?
Right.
This is one of those huge turning points that reshaped the whole 20th century, and Britain, they were right there in the middle of it all.
Mm-hmm.
So today, we're not just going to run through a timeline of events, right? We really want to try and get you to understand, why Britain stepped onto this really devastating global stage. What did their contributions on the battlefields actually look like, across the world? How did life change back home? And what were those lasting impacts on, their empire was vast.
Yeah, it's a period just full of, just complexities and consequences. And I think when you understand Britain's role, you get a much deeper understanding of World War I itself, and the world that came after.
Totally. So let's just imagine ourselves back in Europe in 1914.
Okay.
Right. Tensions, they're just about to boil over. You have two major alliances, right? You have the Triple Entente, so Britain, France, Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy, though later Italy will switch sides.
A little foreshadowing there.
Yeah, it's a bit of a plot twist.
Yeah.
But what was really making this atmosphere so volatile? What were the things at play?
Well, you've got a number of factors. Think about imperial rivalries.
Okay.
Right? So these countries all over Europe are fiercely competing for colonies all over the world, resources.
Yeah.
They're all vying for power, for influence, and that breeds, suspicion and mistrust.
Recipe for disaster.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
You've also got, at the same time, significant military buildups happening.
Okay.
Especially Germany. And their rapid expansion of their military, particularly their navy, was really unsettling to Britain especially.
Yeah.
And then you have a sort of underlying all of this, all these really intricate diplomatic agreements, a lot of them secret, which meant that any small conflict, like a little spark, could just explode into a much larger war. And these alliances, they were meant for security, but they could just as easily drag everyone in.
Right. They're like a double-edged sword.
Exactly.
And then you have that spark, right? The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914.
Yeah.
It's hard to believe, looking back, how one event, like one act of violence, could have such global consequences.
Oh, it was a total hinge moment, know. And Austria-Hungary, with Germany kind of backing them up, they issued this really harsh ultimatum to Serbia. I mean, they basically knew Serbia couldn't accept it.
Oh, so it was kind of deliberate almost.
It seemed like it, yeah. And when Serbia didn't fully comply, Austria-Hungary declared war.
So they were pushing for this conflict.
It seemed like it, yeah. And, it's important to remember Britain wasn't automatically in it at this point.
Right. They weren't immediately involved.
Yeah.
So for a while, it was kind of like, okay, are they going to stay out of this?
Yeah, there was a possibility.
But then Germany invades Belgium. August 4th, 1914.
Yeah.
Huge turning point.
Yeah.
Why was that so decisive for Britain?
This really triggered a long-standing commitment. So going back to 1839, you've got the Treaty of London, right?
Right.
Which guaranteed Belgian neutrality.
Right.
Britain was a big part of this treaty, and they felt a real obligation to uphold it. So when Germany invaded neutral Belgium, that was their immediate justification for war.
Okay, so it was upholding international law, basically, honoring their word.
Yeah, it was seen as a clear violation of international law.
Yeah.
But of course, there was more to it than just that.
Okay, so what else was at play?
Well, strategically, Germany was a problem.
Oh.
They were becoming so powerful so quickly, and that was a threat to Britain, who had been dominant for so long. Their naval expansion especially, that was a direct challenge to Britain's control of the seas. Those trade routes, those were vital to their empire.
Absolutely, yeah.
So Britain was really looking at the possibility of, a German-dominated Europe and maybe even more, and they weren't happy about that. Some historians even say that, even though that treaty was legally binding, Britain might have found a way to stay out if it wasn't for this need to contain Germany.
Okay, so it's almost like the treaty was the excuse they needed.
It's hard to say for sure, but the strategic situation was definitely a huge factor.
It's fascinating how those two things kind of come together.
Yeah.
So they weren't just protecting Belgium, they were protecting their own interests.
Exactly. They had to stop Germany from, upsetting the balance of power.
Yeah.
And so on August 4th, 1914, Britain declared war.
A decision with, like, global consequences. Yeah. So let's look at the military side of things. You mentioned earlier that Britain's army was, well, smaller than Germany's or France's. What was their military like when the war started?
Right. So Britain, they had always focused on their navy. Being an island nation, it made sense. They needed to protect their shores, their empire.
Yeah, makes sense.
So their army, while it was professional and well-trained, I mean, these guys were volunteers, long service volunteers. It wasn't built for the kind of massive land war that was about to happen.
Right, so they were ready for one type of war, but this was totally different.
Exactly. But when they entered the war, they quickly sent the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force, over to France. These were the best of the best, highly skilled, very disciplined, but still they were outnumbered by the Germans, who had a huge conscript army.
Yeah, and they were thrown into battle pretty quickly, right? The Battle of Mons?
Yeah, August 1914, their first big engagement.
Yeah.
And they fought hard, but the Germans just had so many men, they had to retreat.
And wasn't that around the time that trench warfare started to, like, become the norm?
Yeah, that's right. This was the beginning of it.
Yeah.
Both sides, I mean, they just had these incredibly powerful weapons, machine guns, artillery. So they started digging in for protection.
So it's almost like the weapons themselves forced this new kind of warfare.
Yeah, it was a reaction to the technology. And it led to those, brutal stalemates that defined the Western Front for years.
It's hard to imagine what it must have been like.
Yeah, unimaginable. And, pretty quickly, Britain realized they needed a lot more soldiers.
Yeah. So how did they do that? Like, how did they get more men?
Well, at first there was this huge wave of patriotism. They had those famous recruitment campaigns, like that "Your Country Needs You" poster with Lord Kitchener pointing right at you.
Oh, I've seen that one.
Yeah, incredibly powerful imagery.
Yeah.
And hundreds of thousands of men volunteered. They were driven by, patriotism, a sense of duty, and a lot of them thought the war would be over quickly.
Yeah, that it would be a short war.
Yeah. But of course it wasn't. And as the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, it became clear that volunteers weren't enough.
Right, so they had to make a big change.
Yeah.
That's when they introduced conscription, right?
Exactly. 1916, the war was it was going on, and the losses were huge. They realized they had to do something drastic. So they made military service mandatory for men between 18 and 41.
Must have been a controversial decision.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was a big debate about individual liberty versus, the needs of the nation.
Yeah, yeah. And then, of course, there's the Battle of the Somme.
Yeah.
1960. I mean, just a horrific example of the brutality of this war.
It really was. I mean, the first day, July 1st, that was the single worst day in British military history. Nearly 60,000 casualties. Just in one day.
That number is it's hard to even comprehend.
Yeah. And the losses throughout the whole battle were just staggering. But even in the midst of all that horror, they were learning. The British military was starting to adapt. They got better at using artillery. They started experimenting with tanks. They developed new tactics.
So even in the face of that kind of loss, they were still trying to, like, evolve and adapt.
Yeah, they had to. They were up against, these entrenched defenses. They had to find new ways to fight.
It's almost like horrible kind of laboratory.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. And of course, the war wasn't just on the Western Front.
Right. It was a global conflict.
Britain was fighting in other places, too.
So where else were they involved?
Well, there was Gallipoli in 1915. That was a campaign to try and capture the Dardanelles straight from the Ottoman Empire.
Okay.
Really important waterway.
Yeah.
But it was a disaster. Huge losses for the British, the Australians, the New Zealanders. They had to withdraw.
So a major setback.
Yeah. But in the Middle East, they were more successful. They ended up capturing Jerusalem, Baghdad, key cities from the Ottomans.
So some victories, but also some real defeats.
Yeah, it was a mixed bag. But it shows you how widespread this war was.
Yeah, the scale of it is just mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And all of this, I mean, it must have had a huge impact on life back in Britain.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this was total war. It wasn't just the soldiers at the front. It was everyone. The whole fabric of society changed.
So what were some of the big changes?
Well, the government had to take control of basically everything.
Wow.
They needed resources for the troops, for weapons, for everything. So they had to intervene in ways they never had before.
And I imagine one of the biggest challenges was food.
Oh, yeah. With those German U-boats sinking ships, Britain was in real danger of running out of food.
Yeah, they depended on imports, right?
Heavily. So they had to start rationing. People got ration books, that told them how much bread, meat, sugar they could buy. It was a huge change to daily life.
Yeah, I mean, that must have been tough.
Oh, absolutely. And it wasn't just food. They even changed the clocks. Daylight saving time.
Really? Why?
They needed to be more efficient. More daylight hours for factories, for working.
Wow. So even time itself was affected by the war.
Yeah, it was all hands on deck. Every little bit helped.
And, of course, we can't forget about the role of women.
Absolutely. I mean, the war completely changed the role of women in society.
Yeah.
With so many men away fighting, women stepped up. They worked in factories, making weapons and ammunition. They were nurses on the front lines. Some even joined the police. It was a huge shift.
It's almost like the war forced society to change its views on women.
It definitely challenged a lot of traditional roles. And of course, the government was working hard to shape public opinion.
Through propaganda.
There were posters everywhere,
Yeah.
with patriotic slogans and images, newspapers, films. They were all used to keep people supporting the war.
It's like they had to control the narrative.
Yeah, morale was important.
Yeah.
And they had to keep people on board.
And all these changes, they had lasting effects, right? Like women getting the vote.
Yeah, that was huge. In 1918, partly because of their contributions during the war, women over 30 got the right to vote. It was a big step forward.
Absolutely. And speaking of big changes, let's talk about the empire.
Okay.
Britain wasn't alone in this war.
Yeah.
The empire played a big role.
Huge role. You had troops from Canada, Australia, India, Africa, all fighting alongside the British. And for many of them, they hoped that their sacrifices would lead to more independence after the war.
Yeah.
But the war also really weakened Britain.
In what way?
Well, financially, they had to borrow a lot of money, especially from the U.S. And by the end of the war, they weren't the world's leading financial power anymore.
So the war cost them their top spot.
Yeah, it was a big shift. And politically, it caused a lot of tension within the empire.
Okay.
You had the Easter Rising in Ireland in 1916, a direct challenge to British rule. And in India, you had figures like Gandhi rising to prominence, advocating for self-rule.
So the seeds of, the empire's eventual decline were sown during the war.
In a lot of ways, yeah. The war really accelerated those processes.
So even though Britain won the war, it really changed them.
Absolutely.
So the war ended November 11th, 1918. We still commemorate that day.
Yeah.
What was the immediate impact for Britain?
Well, victory came at a huge cost. Over 900,000 British soldiers died, and millions more were injured, physically and mentally.
Just the scale of that loss. It's hard to grasp.
Yeah. And economically, the country was devastated. It took a long time to recover.
And then there's the Treaty of Versailles, 1919, meant to create a lasting peace. But it had its own consequences.
It did. Some historians argue that the treaty, while it ended the war, also created conditions that led to future conflicts.
Okay.
The terms were really harsh on Germany, and there were a lot of issues that weren't really resolved.
So it was like a peace with a lot of problems baked in.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. And Britain, along with its allies, they had to try to manage this really fragile peace.
While dealing with their own problems.
Exactly.
So World War I really was a turning point for Britain.
Yeah, it marked the end of the Victorian era. It changed the role of women forever, and it really reshaped their place in the world.
A hard-won victory with lasting consequences.
Absolutely.
Well, this has been a really fascinating look at a pivotal moment in history.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
Yeah, it does. And it makes you realize how much this war still shapes the world today. I mean, the borders we have, the ideologies that clash, the way nations interact, it's all connected to this conflict.
It really is. The echoes are still there.
Yeah, that's a powerful thought. Well, thank you so much for joining me today for this deep dive into Britain's role in World War I.
It's been a pleasure.
It really has. And for all of you listening, thank you for joining us. We hope this has given you a deeper understanding of this incredibly important period in history.